By the way, because it's NA, we're going to have to start calling her Caster Altria. I don't know how I feel about that. I'll be honest. A new year's upon us, and of course that means new servants, new units, new banners to look forward to, new servants to wail for, and of course, as usual, I am here to offer my opinion on servants that I personally would go for and prioritize. Just like the previous two videos I did for 2019 and 2020 respectively, I am going to be only focusing on both new servants and SSR servants. So I'm not really going to talk about too many of the 4-star servants. I'm not going to talk about any of the rerun banners, or I might mention them or, you know, brush over them, but I want to focus mainly on the new characters that we are going to be introduced to for 2022. Now we're going to change it up a little bit. Right now I have a tier list maker open where I have everything divided by 100% must have, highly recommended, good, but there are other and better alternatives. The 4th tier being only go for if you like this character's design or personality or whatever. And the last tier just says welfare, just play the event. This tier list included 4 stars, so I just put the free servants there. And I know because he's technically not free, but he kind of is. I mean, all you have to do is roll for fan point. I'm going to focus mainly on the 5 stars on the SSRs, so all the 4 stars I put down here. And then I have Game Press open on the side so we could take a look at each servant's skills and Noble Phantasm, just so it's easier for you guys to visualize what I'm talking about when I talk about their skills and NP. I also have this calendar open that is by Kalia Mamjuna, so go ahead and follow them, and I give them a shout out, a free shout out, why not? And if it wasn't obvious, spoiler warning, if you don't want to get spoiled for any of the servants, any of the units for next year, or I might mention some story stuff as well, so I want you guys to be warned that there will be spoilers for the game, and just tread carefully if you are sensitive to spoilers. We start off January with the New Year's banner as well as a guaranteed SSR banner. Now, as far as the guaranteed SSR banner goes, that depends on your account. Just look at your account and determine who exactly you want, what exactly you need. That's on you. I can't really give you guys any advice on the guaranteed SSR banner. As far as new servants go, we are introduced to our first 5-star foreigner of this year. And yes, there are a crap ton of foreigners that they're going to introduce throughout the year. Our first 5-star foreigner of this year is Yang Guifei. So Yang, or Servant 275 as China may like to call her at some point, is a 5-star foreigner. Like I said, she is an arts-oriented servant. If you guys have seen my streams in the past, my boss battles in the past, I strongly recommend you guys to go for Yang Guifei. I personally think she is the best single target foreigner in the entire game and one of the best single target servants as far as art servants go in the entire game as well. And the reason I strongly advocate for her is her Noble Phantasm. Her Noble Phantasm does extra damage against burned enemies. And you might be like, well, that's only against burned enemies. How are we going to get them burned? It's actually pretty easy to burn enemies. I mean, her NP also applies burn, but that's after damage, not before damage. So you want to focus on burning the enemies first before using her NP, in which case you would rely on her skills. Her first skill, once it gets buffed, applies a target to herself. And it gets buffed like 10 months after she gets initially released. So you got to wait a while until it's really good. Otherwise, it only works on male enemies. But either way, put a target on herself as well as invincibility. So realistically, she's not going to get damage unless the enemy has to kind of pierce invincibility. And then if you use her third skill, in conjunction with her first skill, when the enemies hit her, regardless if she takes damage or not, thanks to her invincibility, she will apply a defense down as well as a burn on the enemy that hits her for 3 turns. So you want to use her first skill and her third skill before using her Noble Phantasm the following turn, because you want to make sure the enemies get burned, and it will allow her Noble Phantasm to actually do a lot of damage, a lot more than you might think for an art servant, especially when Caster Arturia comes out, which we'll get to her when we get to her. So yes, you can make the argument that she kind of relies too much on enemies being burned in order to do a decent amount of damage, but at the same time, there are 4 command codes currently in JP that allow her attacks to inflict burn upon attacking. So you don't necessarily have to use her first and third skill right off the bat, especially if you don't want to, because you want to save it for later. Maybe you want to save her charge for another turn or invincibility for another turn. You don't necessarily have to rely on that as long as you get her cards that have the command code equipped. Again, there's 4 command codes currently in JP, so 4 out of her 5 cards will be able to be equipped with command codes that inflict burn. And then the 5th command code could be her own. She has her own command code that is obtainable later on in the game that does extra crit damage against burned enemies. Again, she relies a lot on her niche of burning the enemies, but it really isn't that difficult. Combine that with the fact that she could NP loop pretty well thanks to her batteries, thanks to being an art servant, thanks to synergizing really well with caster Otoya. Yang Guofei to me is just one of those servants that if you want a really good single target servant, not even just a foreigner, just a really good single target reliable foreigner that has their own built-in survivability and decent utility and could do a lot of damage given if the enemy is burned, I would honestly put Yang Guofei at highly recommended. You might argue that you're being biased. You obviously really like her, and I do like her, so I might be a little bit biased, but there's really not too many servants that could do what she does. So I can't really say that there are other alternatives to Yang Guofei. I just find her extremely reliable. Also, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because during the summer event, which is like 6, 7, 8 months away from Yang Guofei, they decided to give her a craft essence, a summer craft essence. And honestly, even if you don't like Yang or you feel like you don't need a 5-star foreigner of her caliber, but you want to go for, let's say, BB or Gilgamesh or any of these other SSRs that are returning for New Year's, I would say go for this craft essence in particular, which is, again, is going to be introduced along with this New Year's banner. And I'm pretty sure this is the only time it's going to have a rate up because the following year during 2023, this banner will not have a rerun. So I don't think you will see the CE in the foreseeable future. And this craft essence is really good for looping. It only increases attack because I know some people are very picky when it comes to CEs and whether it increases HP, attack, or both, or whatever. This one only increases attack, so it's really good stat-wise for offensive servants. It has a built-in apply, ignore, or invincibility. Really good, just because it's very convenient for boss fights, for lost belt fights, for very annoying enemies and servants. And of course, it also has increased NP strength, and by 20% if it's max limit broken, and then increase NP gain by 20%, which is good. This is a very good alternative to the Black Grill. Most people like using the Black Grill because it maximizes their NP damage. But if you want something with a bit more utility and a bit more reliability thanks to that increased NP gain, then I would say if you don't want to go for Yang, but you want to go for the other servants and you're kind of tempted, I would say definitely go for the craft essence and try to max limit break it. Honestly, whether or not you're going for Yang, I don't care if you did an 11 shot and you got 5 Yangs and you're pretty much tapped out. I would say still keep going for this craft essence. I think that makes this banner that much more worth it. Now, moving on from January, because January just pretty much has rerun events and old servants coming back. So again, I don't want to focus on the old servants. As far as February goes, we do get 2 banners that have returning servants, one of them being a Rishigal, so I'm sure some of you guys will be very tempted to go for her. Assuming she even comes, she might even come a bit earlier, maybe a bit later, because it is a download campaign event, so there's a chance she may not even show up for February. But we are guaranteed a Valentine's event, which will introduce us to 5-star archer, Sei Shonagon. And Sei is very interesting. She is extremely interesting because looking at her skills, especially her first skill, she has supportive capabilities. She has a generic charisma that also adds on NP gauge to all allies, 10% each turn for 3 turns, as well as a healing. So she has some support. She has some survivability with a 3-time evade for 3 turns, as well as some crits. And of course, her own battery, up to 20%. Her battery isn't that much, but still, if you use it in tandem with her first skill, she actually gets pretty much 50%. She does have a 100% charm resist, which doesn't really come into play that often. But as far as the Noble Phantasm goes, she is very unique in the sense that she does extra damage against neutral servants, shadow servants, and human attribute enemies. So if you face an enemy with all 3 of those factors involved, then she's going to do a crap ton of damage. And obviously she is a quick servant, so you're most likely going to be using her with double Skadi. She can loop. I could confirm that right now. She can loop, although not as efficiently as, let's say, Atalanta as far as other quick archers go. So she has a lot going for her. She has the potential to do a lot of damage. She has some supportive capabilities with her skills, some survivability. She's a quick servant, so she can loop fairly efficiently, not as efficiently as other alternatives. But to be honest, as much as I would recommend Sei Shonagon as a very viable, versatile 5-star archer, I would actually put her right below Yang at the good, but there are other alternatives tier. Just because, yes, there are other alternatives. For example, like I said, if you already have pretty good, pretty reliable NP loopers as far as quick servants go, I wouldn't go for her. But as far as NP damage goes, because again, based on her NP and depending on the traits and attributes of the enemy you're facing, she does have the potential to do a crap ton of damage. But for argument's sake, if you already have Gilgamesh, for example, or Ishtar, or Nikola Tesla, or a lot of these other archers that we already have in our arsenal, or that you may have already in your arsenal, I wouldn't go for Say, just because she is a quick servant, so her damage overall will be slightly lower than her buster counterparts, and at the same time, she does rely on a lot of these different attributes and traits to reach those thresholds. So again, she's versatile, she's viable. I would recommend her personally, but objectively speaking, if you already have all these other different alternatives for both looping and for damage, then you don't necessarily need to go for her. Honestly, if you're going to go for her banner, definitely watch out for this craft essence. Again, this is one of the few craft essences that I'm going to talk about in this video. It's a decent craft essence for quick servants, namely for Kama, of course, because she's the poster child. But I feel like most of us are going to be going for this banner for the CE itself, not necessarily for Say. But yes, her banner is pretty worth it on both the servant and craft essence ends. Moving on from February, of course, we're going to March, which is one of the less eventful months of this year, presumably, because even given the fact that there's two banners, I don't think we're going to get the second banner featuring the Apocrypha servants, just because this was only relevant in JP at the time because of some kind of Apocrypha celebration thing going on. But I don't know if this is going to be a thing in NA, but I guess we'll wait and see. But we should be getting Odysseus for the Kalia Boys or White Day event. He's an Arts 5-star rider, and unlike the previous two 5-stars we talked about, he is a non-limited 5-star servant. So I would say right off the bat, just based on the fact that he's not limited, I wouldn't go for him, just for the sheer fact that he's not limited. And as somebody who has gotten spooked by him in JP in my other account, it is possible to get him, definitely 100% possible. So right away, I would not go for him unless you want the craft essences. And there are other guy servants that will rotate with him during the Kalia Boys event. So you could definitely look at that. I'll put a link in the description of all the events that should be coming out. But Odysseus himself, he's an AoE art servant. So if you're a new player, you don't have that many great arts loopers, definitely go for him. He does have the remove defensive buffs from all enemies first with his AoE NP, which obviously could come in handy against very annoying enemies and very annoying challenges, for example. But if you're a player, let's say you have Da Vinci Lily, you don't really need to go for Odysseus, just because Da Vinci Lily, as far as looping goes, as far as farming goes, she's gonna have you covered as far as a 5-star arts looping rider goes. He does have his own battery, 30% battery, charm immune, so he has some utility there. He does have some supportive capabilities by buffing all the allies quick and arts. He does have something going for him, and you may argue that you should go for him anyway, just because he has the buff remover resist with his third skill, as well as invincibility, which makes him a bit more, I guess you could say, reliable than other arts riders. But honestly, he's good, but there are other alternatives. I would honestly put him down here as well, but I can't ignore the fact that he is pretty good. It's just the fact that he's not limited. That's the only reason why I want to put him lower. In my opinion, you should only save for limited servants, for servants that are very, very good. Speaking of Lost Belt 5 and non-limited servants, moving on from March, we are going to go to April, where we are going to be introduced to two separate banners for Lost Belt 5 Part 2. We're going to be introduced to Canis, 4-star Lancer, who again, I'm not going to focus on because I want to focus on the 5-stars. And the 5-star being a new saber, new non-limited saber of Dioscuri or Pollux and Castor. So just like Odysseus, because they are non-limited, I would say skip out on them. As far as arts looping goes, though, I would recommend them if you don't have other alternatives. Like, let's say you don't have Neurobride, you don't have Musashi, you don't have all these other single target sabers in the game. Let's say you're a newer player, or maybe it's an unlucky player. Then I would say go for them, just because their looping capabilities, their overall damage is actually pretty good. And they have a special passive skill. They increase their NP gauge by 3% every turn. Their NP looping is actually pretty reliable thanks to that. They have an apply ignore invincibility, which again, I strongly recommend going for servants and craft essences that has ignore invincibility or ignore evade or anything of that nature is automatically, in my book, pretty good. But again, just for the sheer fact that they are non-limited, I would put them with Odysseus right here. Good, but again, there are other alternatives out there. So just like most chapters, Lost Build 5 Part 2 will have a second banner associated with it, this time with a limited servant in the form of Romulus Quirinus. Now, like I said earlier in the video, spoiler alert, he's the Grand Lancer. I'm just gonna say it right now. He is the Grand Lancer who's introduced in Lost World 5 Part 2. So right away, from a lore perspective, from a character's perspective, he might be somebody you might want, honestly. He might be somebody you might go for just for the sheer fact that he's a Grand Lancer. But gameplay-wise, he's not really broken. He is very, I guess, gimmicky, I guess you could say. Well, just like Yang, he does rely on inflicting a certain thing against the enemies, but his thing is applying the Roman trait to all enemies. And this is something that is apparent in his first skill, his third skill, and of course his NP, which applies the Roman trait, and he does extra damage depending on how many Roman traits you've stacked on a single enemy. That's why he does it a lot with his skills and his NP. It's a maximum 10 stacks, and he gets 200% extra damage, which is a lot. But 10 stacks is a lot to ask for to get that much extra damage. To only get 200%, I feel like if it was like, let's even go as far as like 500%, then I would say he would be an extremely broken 5-star Lancer. But yeah, he has his own invincibility 2 times, 3 turns, his own battery that goes up to 30%. He is buster oriented, so right away he works really well with Merlin. So he is good. He is really, really good for being a crit servant, for being a buster servant, for having a decent NP. But I wouldn't call him broken. Again, he's a bit gimmicky. He relies a lot on the Roman trait to do massive damage. He is an AoE, so he has some competition in the form of Karna, in the forms of Ereshkigal. Again, a lot of these servants are probably going to end up on this tier, to be honest. I would say Romulus would go in this tier. I wouldn't highly recommend him, because even though, yeah, him and Yang sort of do a similar thing where they get extra damage depending on if an enemy has a certain debuff, but I would put him lower just because Yang is a lot more reliable in terms of, and you only need 1 burn to do 150% extra damage with Yang, whereas Romulus, yeah, he's AoE, so he's already gonna do less damage, but at the same time, he needs 10 Roman traits to be inflicted to do 200%. Which is only 50% higher than Yang. That's why I put Yang higher. I'm not saying Yang is better than Romulus, and just doing a little comparison between the two, just because some people might think, well, if you're going to put Romulus down here, then yeah, you should put Yang there. No, but no. So yeah, I would say if you already have, let's say, Ereshkigal, which a lot of you guys might already have, she has a better NP battery, or I should say a higher NP battery, so she's a bit more reliable as far as NP looping, especially nowadays. So I wouldn't say that there are better alternatives necessarily. I would just say there are other alternatives. Like going for Romulus isn't really that necessary unless you want that gimmicky sort of thing that he has with the Roman trait. And yeah, in a weird way, he does work well with Boudica, ironically, because Boudica, with her first skill, I believe, does extra damage against Roman enemies. So if you bring her with Romulus and then have Romulus do his thing where he applies the Roman trait on enemies, then I guess he could work as a semi-support for Boudica. But again, that's very gimmicky. I don't see that being a super reliable strategy. Very niche. I would focus on other limited servants in this year. Also, before we move on to next month, I just want to say that for the download campaign featuring Musashi, she is also going to be accompanied by a variety of other 5 stars, as you can see, like Gilgamesh, Kentucky, etc., etc. And in this download campaign, I believe this is when we are introduced to our very first Ssr ticket. Now, I know I said I was only going to focus on new content, but I feel like this is something I need to point out because a lot of NA players may or may not be aware of this. But essentially what this free Ssr ticket is you don't pay for it. Like it says in the name, it's a free Ssr ticket, but you could only pick non-limited 5-star servants, and you can only pick non-limited 5-star servants that are not story locked. So you can't pick story locked servants, you can't pick limited servants, you can only pick from a small pool of 5-star servants. And again, I'll put a link in the description to the information about this download campaign. So if you want to look into that to see which servants you could choose from right away, most people are going to choose waiver. People call this the waiver ticket pretty much. If you don't have waiver, then yeah, that would be my recommendation as well. So finally, moving on from April, we are going to go to May, and May is going to be fun because of course we get some rerun. We get a rerun event of the previous Guda Guda event, but arguably more importantly, we are going to be introduced to the Fate Requiem event. And of course, there is a pre-campaign event featuring Ganesha and Osaka Behime. But arguably more importantly, we're going to be introduced to another 5-star foreigner. This time a quick 5-star AoE foreigner as opposed to Yang's Arts single target. So this 5-star foreigner, Voyager, is, like I said earlier, a quick NP looping servant. He has, I believe, a 50% battery. The only problem with him, from my experience, is that his NP gain isn't as efficient as other NP quick looping servants like Dantes, like Lancelot Berserker, etc., etc. So even though he has a 50% battery, he does suffer quite a bit from that relatively low NP gain. And his damage isn't that great at NP1. You definitely want to upgrade his NP damage, despite the fact that he puts his own quick effectiveness up and does decrease the quick resistance of just one enemy, not even all 3 enemies, just one enemy. And you're most likely going to be using this turn 1. So that decreased quick resistance against the first node, if you're farming, for example, isn't really going to make that big of a difference. And then he does have a bit of crit capabilities and support as far as his 3rd skill goes. And his NP is probably the most unique about him, because it does extra damage against heaven trait enemies, 150%, which is pretty high. So if you're facing a heaven trait enemy, then holy crap, he's going to do decent damage. Some support with increased NP gauge of all allies by 20%. And if it's a pseudo servant, like let's say Muramasa, Ishtar, Parvati, etc., he is going to increase their NP gauge by a further 10%. So that's a whopping 30% to the entire party, or to the rest of the party, assuming they are pseudo servants, which you're most likely not going to do. Again, you're most likely going to team him up with double Skadi, which would be the optimal way to play him. I will say this, even though he's not necessarily the best in terms of farming, because again, there are other much more better, I would say, alternatives like Dantes, like Lancelot, Atlanta, Valkyrie, Parvati, etc. In terms of a longer battle, a longer drawn out battle, this secondary effect from his Noble Phantasm does come in handy in a longer battle. Even though he is objectively a really good servant, if you have Dantes, if you have all these other quick looping servants, I would put him down here. Again, a lot of these servants are probably going to be in this tier. To be honest, a lot of these servants are going to be in this tier. Now from May, we are going to go down to June, which we're going to have the rerun of the summer banners from the previous year featuring Musashi. And this is going to be your last chance to get Merlin for a while, outside of guaranteed SR banners. So if you want to go for Merlin, this is going to be one of your last chances to go for him in a banner where he's alone. So definitely go for him if you don't have him already. Of course, we get the second banner for the previous summer event. And we may or may not get this Rhaenys banner raid up, just because we had another Rhaenys raid up in 2021 for NA. So I don't know if they're going to bring her back or just bring Sherlock Holmes. Unsure what they're going to do with this one. Anyway, for July, the main thing that we have to talk about for the 5th anniversary of FGO is definitely Caster Arturia. Now, I don't think I have to talk about her too much. I think most players already know of her infamy, whether or not you play JP, or if you're an NA exclusive player. If you don't know about her, then you must be living under a rock, or you must be a new player, because right away, I'm just going to go straight to the tier list. She's a 100% must-have. If you're not going for Caster Arturia, for whatever reason, for 2022, if she is not in your lineup of servants you want to go for this coming year, then you're not only doing your account a disservice, you're not only doing your waifus, husbandos, and whatever in between a disservice, you're doing yourself a disservice, because you're gonna find yourself really wanting Caster Arturia if you decide not to go for her, because she just elevates your entire account and makes everything that much more convenient. She makes a lot of quests freaking easy, and if you don't like that, if you like a challenge, then by all means, I respect that. But in terms of farming, just talking purely about farming, take the challenges and boss fights out of this. In terms of farming, she elevates almost every art servant to the next level as far as looping. So you have to 100% go for her. If you're not, again, you're doing everyone a disservice. Your family might even disown you, to be honest, if you don't go for Caster Arturia. It would be in your best interest, in everyone's best interest, if you go for her. I'm not even exaggerating. And if for whatever reason you don't know what she does, for whatever reason you don't know what she does, I mean, let's take a gander. First skill, let's go slowly, just so you guys understand why she is a 100% must-have. So charisma, which is like whatever, attack up to everybody. That's pretty standard with a lot of servants. But she also increases NP gauge for all allies, similar to Merlin's first skill. But unlike Merlin's first skill, it's not 20%. No. It's 30% to every ally. That skill alone is already freaking amazing. That skill alone. Now let's look at her second skill. Increase NP gauge for an ally. So you pick a servant in your lineup, whether it's herself or whatever other servant in your frontal lineup, and you increase their NP gauge by 20% at level 10 right away. That's 50% if you include her first skill. So 30% and then 20%, that's 50% to whatever servant you choose. And it has a secondary effect that affects all the allies, including herself, and that is a 30% increase in NP gain for 3 turns. Again, for looping, for arts looping especially, insane. And then her last skill is like the cherry on top. The cherry on top. Increase arts effectiveness for an ally for 3 turns by 50%. 50% for 3 turns. Already good. They could have just kept it at that. But of course, they have to add more brokenness into this skill by applying a special attack to threat to humanity to an ally, which does come in handy sometimes. There are some threat to humanity enemies. A lot of foreigners are threat to humanity. A lot of enemies in the Lost Belts are threat to humanity. So she's really good against a lot of the more current content enemies. And then apply invincibility to an ally for 1 turn to the ally obviously of your choosing. And then you get to her NP. Now look at this NP. Look what it does. Now what it does is increase attack for all allies for 3 turns. And this is what's affected by her NP level. So if you have her at NP 1, it's 30%, which is already pretty high for 3 turns. And then at NP 2, it goes up to 40%. If you get her all the way to NP 5, which I know a lot of you crazy Mo truckers are going to try to do, she goes up to 50% attack up to the entire party, which again, crazy. For 3 turns, 50%, crazy. And then secondary effect is clear debuffs for all allies, which, I mean, who doesn't like that? That speaks for itself. That's really good. But the main thing about her NP, the main thing is that she has this thing called Apply Enforcement Defense, which works pretty similarly to invincibility in the sense that your servants will take no damage from any attack that's coming their way. But what makes it special is that stuff like ignore invincibility and of course ignore evade does not apply to this. So if you have, let's say Merlin, for example, and you use the second skill to give invincibility to all your allies, including himself, but then the enemy has ignore invincibility, they're able to pierce through that, no problem. They're able to pierce through Merlin's second skill very easily. But with Ssr Arturia's NP, even if the enemy has ignore invincibility or ignore evade or apply a sure hit or whatever they might have, it's not going to work. The only way that they're able to bypass this buff, this enforcement defense, this very special form of invincibility, is if the enemy has some form of buff removal pre-NP damage or pre-hit. Otherwise, your servants aren't going to get hit. But do keep in mind, it's a one-time use for 3 turns, which means after 1 hit, it's gone. But if you overcharge it, depending on the overcharge, if you use a NP before hers, or you give her a craft essence that increases her overcharge, or give her some kind of buff, it could be 2 hits, it could be 3 hits, it could be 4 hit, it could be up to 5 hit. Imagine that. 5 hit invincibility that cannot be pierced. And the only way to bypass that is with some kind of buff removal. I don't know what to say. The only thing she's missing, honestly, if we want to nitpick, the only thing Ssr Arturia is missing is some kind of healing capabilities for herself or for the rest of the team. She has no way of healing the team. Otherwise, she is a damn near perfect servant in almost every regard as far as gameplay wise. So if you're not going for her, I don't care what your reason is. You could be the biggest Arturia hater, the biggest Saberface hater on the entire face of this planet. I would still recommend going for this servant. I could be the biggest hater of Arturia faces, of Saber faces. I would still go for her. Honestly, if you're not going for her, then maybe you just want to be the cool kid and want to be different. I don't know. I have no idea. There's really no reason, no good reason not to go for her. Especially like, let's say, okay, I wouldn't say that. Maybe I wouldn't go that far. Maybe you do have a good reason. Maybe there are other servants in the year that you want to prioritize. I understand that. I get that. But at the same time, we're going to get a crap ton of quartz and a crap ton of tickets for anniversary. At least use those resources to try to get Caster Arteria, at least at NP1. If you get her at NP1, she's already good. Although, if you're willing to spend more, from my personal experience as somebody who has her at NP2 in two different accounts, two separate accounts, I would go for her at least NP2 because thanks to her skills and thanks to her card lineup, she has 3 arts cards. She actually gets to 200% NP a lot more often than you might think, especially when it comes to challenge quests and boss fights and stalling, for example. I would go for her NP2 just so you have the capabilities of getting that 2-time hit enforcement defense. That 2-time hit invincibility comes clutch in so many different situations. And at the same time, if you upgrade her NP to NP2, her 30% attack up goes to 40%, which is a pretty big difference in my opinion. It's a noticeable difference. That's what I would say. So if you're willing to spend more on her, more quartz, more tickets, even more money, at least get her at NP2. If you don't really care about her NP and just want to use her for her skills, then don't go for any higher than NP1. NP1's honestly fine as far as most support servants go, including her. A 100% must have, whether she's NP1, NP2, NP5, whatever. As long as she's not NP0, you're doing yourself a huge favor by going for her, honestly. So hopefully, after getting Caster Arteria, again, whether NP1 or higher, hopefully you're still going to have enough resources for the next month, because during August, that's when, by the way, this other banner, this other FGO 5th anniversary banner, the only thing special about it is that it has 5-star CEs, or I should say 4-star CEs, that have special art on it, like limited CEs. So if you want to roll here for those CEs, then you can go ahead. They don't really do anything. They're just for collection purposes. But again, if you want to go there, you could go there. But as far as new servants go, we are going to be introduced to of course, the 2022 summer event. And the first banner will include Kiara, Summer Kiara, Summer Ilya, and Summer Burnhild, as well as the Honey Lake CE that has Yang on it. If you're going to go for Yang, go for this craft essence as well. Even if you don't want any of the servants that are featured on the summer banners, I would say if you're a fan of Yang and you went really, really hard for Yang and you got her, definitely try to get the CE just because it has apply ignore invincibility, which is good utility wise, and also applies 40% special attack versus burn enemies. So again, go for this craft essence if you're going for Yang. But anyway, let's talk about Kiara. So Kiara is a very special servant in a lot of ways. First of all, she's one of the few 5-star moon cancers that we have in the game, alongside BB Summer and of course Ganesha. But what makes her unique, and only JP players and people who have seen gacha rolls online would know this, but when you pull her, and again, this is just an aesthetic thing, this is just something that is just cool to look at, but when you pull her, when you see that gold Moon Cancer card, I'll try to find a clip and play it for you guys. But when you see that gold Moon Cancer card, it transforms into a custom Moon Cancer card exclusive to Kiara herself. I'll play a clip. I'll try to find one.
Sorry. Okay, that was a long pause, which probably means I'm gonna get something juicy. Get something. What the? Whoa! Whoa! Yeah, special animation!
She's really cool in that regard, in the fact that she's a Moon Cancer and that she does that when you summon her. So it's really hype when you get her. But what about gameplay-wise? What does she offer gameplay-wise? So I will say this. If you already have Space Ssr, for example, or even Musashi Berserker, you're pretty much set for arts looping. If you have Caster Arteria, you're pretty much set. But if you don't, I would say go for Summer Kiara. I would say Summer Kiara, if we're going to go to the tier list real quick, I would say she's hovering between highly recommended and good, but there are other alternatives. Like, again, if you have Space Ssr or other very, very good arch looping servants, then technically she would be in this tier, but chances are you may want to still go for her because she is a very, very good arch looping Moon Cancer. And again, she's an arch looping Moon Cancer. Moon Cancer. Just having that option of having a looping Moon Cancer is really good. So as far as her skills go, as you can see, her first skill does a lot. It has a lot of utility. It gives her some survivability with guts. It removes debuffs. It restores her HP, increases her NP damage. Applies a mermaid nourishment. So this is one of her more, I guess, fun skills, gimmicky skills, I guess you could say. Where every turn it applies a higher, I guess, tier, a higher version, a higher level of the mermaid nourishment buff. And the more you stack it, the more effective your second and third skill will be. So if we look at her second skill, for example, it's an NP battery with crit star drop. At level 10, it gives 30% NP battery, which is already decent. But if she has the mermaid nourishment status, let's say she has a level 2 mermaid nourishment status, let's say, then it's gonna go up by 10% for each level. So if you have 2 mermaid nourishments, this 30% goes to 50, and it doesn't go any higher. I believe. I don't think it goes any higher than 50%. So she has the potential of having a 50% battery with her second skill, which you're most likely going to use the second skill during the third turn, assuming you're farming. So if you're farming, you definitely use her first skill during the first turn, and then you're going to save her second skill for the last turn, where it's going to be maximized to 30%. And it also increases the crit star drop rate by 5. It already drops 20 crit stars, so having an extra 5 is actually, not that big of a difference, but still. So as you can see in Game Press, they decided to put a difference. So if you have another mermaid nourishment, it goes to 40. If you have another, it goes to 50. And it only goes up twice. It could only go up twice, I believe. Her third skill is also affected by the mermaid nourishment buff. And again, her third skill has a lot going for it. So right away, she has some semi-support capabilities where she applies evade to all allies. So if you team her up with Caster Arturia, not only are you going to rely on Caster Arturia's enforcement defense, you're also going to have Kiara out there with evade to all allies. So very good synergistically wise, being an art servant that is able to protect the team alongside Caster Arturia. She also removes sure hit buffs from enemies, so it's almost guaranteed that the evade will help protect your team. Decrease the defense of all enemies for 3 turns, decrease their arts resistance by 3 turns, and applies a fascination status. So this is another interesting thing about Kiara's skill set. So depending on the mermaid nourishment status, the decreased defense debuff goes from 20% at level 10 to 25% all the way to 30%, assuming you have 2 stacks of the mermaid nourishment skill. So again, you use her first skill turn 1, and then by the second turn she'll have 1 stack of the mermaid nourishment skill, because it stacks every turn. And then by the third turn, you'll be able to get your 50% battery. She is AoE, so just like most looping servants, or really all looping servants, I would go for at least NP2. And if you go for NP3 or higher, then I would definitely do that. But again, if you already technically have Spacious Star, then you don't necessarily need to go for Kiara. But Kiara does offer something that Spacious Star doesn't, because Spacious Star is pretty much a dedicated offensive servant, whereas Kiara does offer some utility and some supports as far as applying evade to all the allies. And she also has extra damage per mental debuff stack, so this goes really well with her third skill as far as the fascination status on all enemies. That's treated as a mental debuff. So she has the potential of doing a lot of damage tandem with Caster Arturia's buffs as well. So Kiara is honestly a really good servant. But again, if you don't really care about all the other stuff she does, and all you want is a really good arch looper, but you already have Spacious Star, you just stick with Spacious Star. Arguably, she is still the more efficient between the two, but Kiara is definitely no slouch and is a really good looper in her own way. Also, before anyone freaks out, she does have a chance of instant death, which does suck for NP looping, but she applies the instant death after damage, not before damage. So because usually when you're trying to loop, like let's say with Nidacris, and Nidacris instant death does proc, or instant kill does proc, then she won't get any NP refund back. Kiara doesn't really have that problem, since the instant death applies after she does damage with her Noble Phantasm. So Kiara will have a refund back regardless if her instant kill does proc or not. So don't have to worry about that. That was like a big scare back in the day, but it applies after, so it's okay. Just like every other summer banner, we are going to have a second banner for this year's summer, which will have Abigail Williams. And yes, of course, there's going to be a male banner that's going to have Sigurd and a couple of 4 stars. But again, we're going to focus mainly on the new servants. And this one's going to have Abigail, Tomoe Gozen, and Murasaki. And Abigail being the 5-star, I'm going to focus more on her. So just like her normal form, Summer Abby is also a foreigner. So this is the 3rd foreigner that we're getting this year, and not the last foreigner that we're getting this year. She's also a Buster servant, but this time she is AoE. And honestly, she is a decent servant. I wouldn't say broken. I wouldn't say extremely good, on the same level as let's say Kiara or Yang as far as being a really viable foreigner. But obviously she is AoE. So her 3rd skill does have a 50% battery and a Buster resistance down to a single enemy. Which again, as an AoE, just doing a Buster card resistance down to single enemy is kind of like eh. But if you're using that on like the boss servant, for example, on the 3rd turn, then honestly that's not that bad. So yes, definitely save her NP battery for the last turn if you can do that. And her 2nd skill is similar to her normal form skill, where it inflicts terror on the enemies. So there's a chance of the enemy getting stunned, which again comes in handy. Which does come in handy. But what makes her unique is she introduces a new mechanic in the game that's similar to Stun, to Charm, called Sleep. Now, just like Charm and Stun, it prevents the enemy from virtually doing anything for a turn. But unlike Stun and Charm, if you hit the enemy while it's asleep, they will wake up, essentially. So you inflict sleep via this skill, but then you decide to attack that enemy, they will wake up right away. So it's like they weren't asleep to begin with. This skill also does remove buffs from the enemy, so really good. Only a single enemy though, so honestly, if it was AoE, that would make it a lot better, but whatever. Same thing with the sleep, actually. The sleep is only for 1 enemy. And she also decreases their defense while they're asleep. And her NP doesn't really do anything that crazy. It does remove defensive buffs, which again, very good against evade enemies, against invincibility, but otherwise pretty standard. Buster NP does decrease enemies defense for 3 turns. All the enemies defense goes down. So I would say, as far as AoE foreigners go, at least pre-Koinskaya, because with Koinskaya or Tomovich, Abigail does become a pretty decent Buster looper. But as it stands, even in JP, I would argue this. I would say she's good just because of that 50% NP battery. She's really good in that sense. Very easy to access her NP. And she does have a decent set of utility with the chance of stunning, with the sleep, with the removing buffs. Otherwise, I would just put her at good, because there are technically other alternatives outside of her, and some may argue better alternatives. She really isn't that special. I hate to say that, Abby, I'm sorry, but you're really not, you don't really stand out as far as Buster servants go. But again, if you need a AoE foreigner, she's actually not that bad. Moving on to September, and if I remember correctly, September is actually one of the more, I guess, quote unquote dead months, because it's just a lot of returning servants. I believe Scathach, for example, is coming back because of a Grailfront event, and Grailfront is this new event type that will be introduced to NA this year. I won't get into the mechanics of it, but yeah, Scathach comes back. She also gets a bunny costume, I believe. But otherwise, September is kind of gonna be a relatively, I guess, quote unquote dead month as far as new content is concerned. Anyway, moving on to October. We're gonna get a new Guda Guda event. So I believe this is the pre-campaign featuring Okida and Hijikata, but we are also introduced to the 5-star ruler, Himiko. So Himiko is a very unique ruler, and I would strongly recommend her. In fact, right away, I'm gonna put her at highly recommend, because she offers something that not too many other servants can offer in her NP, and that's the only reason I'm putting her this high on the tier list, because on her NP, not only does she increase the allies and herself's Buster effectiveness up for 3 turns, she also increases their NP overcharge level for all allies by 2. It's a one-time use, but still, it's a 2-stage up overcharge for 3 turns, and 30% flat on the Buster effectiveness. And if you upgrade her NP level, it could go up to 50%. And of course, increases critical damage for all allies for 2 turns. Depending on the overcharge, it could go higher. So if you NP loop with her, which she does have a battery, then you could get even higher, up to 75, maybe even higher. The reason why this is really good, this particular part where she increases NP overcharge, is if you team her up with Caster Arturia, let's go back to her for real quick. And if you remember correctly, but her overcharge effect is what involves the enforcement defense. So at 100%, it's only going to have a one-time hit, right? It's only going to have a one-time hit. But if you team up Caster Arturia with Himiko, right? If you team her up with Himiko, Himiko is going to increase all the allies NP overcharge level by 2. So automatically, it's going to... Arturia's NP, Caster Arturia's NP is going to go from a 2-hit to a 3-hit invincibility, basically. 3-hit unpierceable invincibility. And if you use Himiko's NP directly before Caster Arturia's NP, that's an extra overcharge. So those two have insane synergy together. Even though Himiko is a buster servant and is a looping servant in general, her plus Caster Arturia and Merlin, those 3 is like the ultimate turtle team. So if you're a fan of turtle teams, if you're a fan of just insane crit damage, I highly recommend Himiko, just because she offers something that not too many other servants could offer with the NP overcharge level, and the fact that she synergizes with an art servant and with Merlin. Team her up with Caster Arturia and Merlin, you pretty much win. The only bosses, the only challenges, the only quests where you're gonna have a hard time with if you bring Himiko is against Avengers, and if there's a weird gimmick that has a buff removal or a buff block or skill block or NP seal or anything of that nature that prevents Himiko or Caster Arturia or Merlin from doing anything. Those 3 together is one of the best or one of the craziest turtle teams out there. But don't get the wrong idea. Just because like you're gonna most likely use Himiko in a turtle team with Caster Arturia and Merlin, or even double Caster Arturia or double Merlin, that doesn't necessarily mean that this team is gonna take like 30, 40, 50 turns to beat the enemies, because this team actually has the capabilities of inflicting high damage. If you look at Himiko's skills, increase attack to all allies, it's a charisma skill, but it also has a gain 8 crit stars each turn for all allies. So that's up to 24 crit stars. That's 8 for each servant. So if you have a full team in the front, that's 24 every turn. So that already goes really well with the fact that she increases critical strength for all allies for 3 turns via her NP. But then look at her other skills. Increase own buster damage effectiveness by 3 turns. So she's gonna have 30%. Special attack to demonic, which is kind of niche, but that's a 50%. So you could bring her against demonic enemies, and there's quite a few demonic enemies and servants, to be honest. Apply invincibility, which is kind of putting a hat on top of a hat, just because you're most likely going to be relying on Caster Arturia's enforce defense, as well as Merlin's second skill if you're teaming Himiko up with them. But still, it's nice to have that extra bit of invincibility, especially since she's going to be your main damaging servant for that turtle team. But her third skill is a 50% battery. Any servant with a 50% battery or higher automatically will be good. And she also increases her buster card star gather rate for 1 turn, and increases the buster card critical strength by 1 turn, which 1 turn might seem like it's too short, but still, with everything else going on with this servant and the buff stacking you could do, and if you team her up with Merlin, her buster effectiveness will always be high anyway. Her damage will be high regardless. She is a really good servant. Obviously, if you don't have Caster Arturia, or if you don't have Merlin, you don't have any of them for whatever reason, I'll actually bump down Himiko to even as low as this. Only go for them if you like the designer character. But chances are, if you at least are gonna have Caster Arturia by the time Himiko comes out, I highly recommend Himiko. Although, assuming that you're burnt out of quartz and tickets and money because of the previous events, the previous gachas, then you might even put Himiko down here as well. Good, but you don't necessarily need to go for her. But as far as giving something that is very unique to her and that other servants aren't able to provide, I would go for Himiko. I would even stop at 1. As somebody that has her only at NP 1, that NP overcharged with her NP, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether she's NP 1 or higher. Especially in a stalling turtle team, it really doesn't matter what her NP level is. Obviously, the higher her NP level, the better her NP effect is as far as the buster effectiveness is. and as far as, I guess, overcharging capabilities. But otherwise, I would just get 1 copy of her. She's going to be fine no matter what. Obviously, as a ruler class, she's also very bulky. You're talking about a team that just cannot be touched unless there's a buff removal gimmick or some kind of other hindering gimmick, depending on the challenge request. But anyway, moving on from October, we should be getting a Thanksgiving banner. We don't know exactly what we're going to get because JP doesn't have Thanksgiving banners. That's an NA exclusive thing. So really, it's up in the air who the Thanksgiving servants will be. If we're to make a guess, maybe Abby and Hokusai, just because the preceding events will involve a lot of foreigners. So it would make sense if the Thanksgiving banner involves Abby and or Hokusai. So that would be my guess, but don't take my word for it. But as you can see here, your eyes don't deceive you. Your eyes don't deceive you. Not only are we getting an assortment of 4-star summer servants coming back, Yang is also coming back. And this is also when she gets her buff to her first skill. So if you don't want to go for Yang at the beginning of the year, which I strongly am opposed to, just because her first banner obviously involves event limited exclusive CEs, particularly, again, this craft essence featuring Musashi that has the ignore invincibility and all these other great effects. I would definitely go for that banner as opposed to this rerun banner. But if for whatever reason you're not interested in the event craft essences that are with Yang during her first banner, you could definitely wait for this one. Just looking at the banners that came before Yang with, October and then August and then July, I wouldn't go here just because they're probably not going to have a lot of resources to begin with. And then when you take into account the Imaginary Scramble event banner that features 2 new 5-stars, one of them being a non-limited rider, being Nemo, and then one of them being a new 5-star foreigner. Again, another 5-star foreigner. How many 5-star foreigners are we getting this year? This is the last 5-star foreigner we're getting, but still, a lot of foreigners. I think 4 in total. We got Yang, of course, Voyager, Abby, Summer Abby, and now Van Gogh. So we have a 5-star rider with Nemo, non-limited, and then a limited 5-star foreigner in the form of Van Gogh. So let's start with Nemo first. So just like with the case of Odysseus and Dioscuri, I would say right off the bat, don't go for Nemo. Again, he's a non-limited servant. There's a chance he could spook you. And looking at his skills, he's a bit gimmicky in the sense that he relies on being near water and being in imaginary space. That's what it further increases the charisma aspect of his first skill to all allies. So in those situations where you're near water or imaginary space, he could be good. But again, it's a bit niche. It's one of those things. You're not really gonna find yourself in that situation that often. His second skill has a guts, a 5-turn guts, NP battery that goes up to 30% at level 10, and it also has an extra effect where if his guts does activate for whatever reason, if he gets hit by a crit or by an NP and then it procs and then he survives, then he will get an extra 50% right off the bat after his guts procs. So in terms of looping, because if you look at his third skill has a lot to do with arts. Arts effect is up for all allies for 3 turns, 20%, and then further increases it if he's near water or imaginary space, just like his first skill. So in terms of arts looping, he's actually not that bad. He is a single target though, so in terms of farming, he's pretty much non-existent. But in terms of single target capabilities, he's actually not that bad. He also does extra damage against giant enemies, kind of similar to Proto Arthur in that regard, and applies sure hit if he's near water or imaginary space, and increases his NP strength further with near water or imaginary space. So again, he relies a lot on being near water and imaginary space, if that was not obvious yet. So he's okay. He's decent in terms of looping, in terms of having some kind of support capabilities in arts teams. But again, I would say there are better alternatives out there, and just the fact that he's not limited, I would even go as far as putting him down here, to be honest. And that might be going too far. Some people might disagree with that, but it's just this fact that he's very gimmicky and very niche with the near water and imaginary space aspect. Is I would put him down here. I'm not necessarily saying he's bad. I'm not saying Nemo's bad by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, none of these servants this year, I would say, are particularly bad. It's just I would prioritize some over the other, in which case being a non-limited servant that's very niche and very gimmicky, I definitely would put him down there. Because with at least Odysseus and Dioscuri, who are also both arts non-limited servants, they're not as gimmicky. as Nemo. Nemo relies a lot on his gimmick to be really good. Otherwise, he's a decent servant. But if you already have, let's say, 4-star Ryoma as your single target rider, you really don't need Nemo. Again, he could always spook you, so you could always hope for that. So the other servant in rotation with Nemo is, of course, Van Gogh, another 5-star foreigner, the 4th and last 5-star foreigner of this year. In my opinion, Van Gogh in a lot of ways is probably the most unique servant to come out of this year. So looking at the skills, look at this. What is this? So applies guts to self, that's pretty straightforward, but then applies 3 separate curses on herself. 100 damage per turn, so it's not that bad, but also for 10 turns each, and increases own NP gauge for every curse stack. So essentially, if you're just looking at her first skill, if you wait 6 turns when this is done cooling down, she's still kind of gonna have the initial curses from the first time you use the skill, and then when you use it again, she will get 10% for every curse she got. But of course, there are other ways to get curse via her other skills. So second skill, again, a lot going on with this servant, is 150% chance, Jesus, decrease defense for all enemies for 3 turns, decrease quick resist for all enemies by 20 turns, and then applies evade to all allies. So just like Summer Kiara has a built-in apply evade for 1 time to all of your allies, which again, very good in a longer battle, very good in a challenge quest of some sort. And she also restores all allies by 300 HP each for 5 turns for each of those turns. So that's what, 1500 overall, which isn't a lot, but you know, it's something. And then applies curse to all allies, 100 damage for each turn for 10 turns. But again, with the restore HP, kind of mitigates that for at least 5 turns. But you're gonna see this all comes into head with her 3rd skill. So with her 3rd skill, everything will make sense. So looking at the 3rd skill, again, a lot going on with this servant. Increase attack for an ally for 3 turns. You're most likely going to use it on herself because she's going to be your main offensive unit in most circumstances. Increase critical star gather rate for an ally. Again, most likely going to be herself. The 3rd effect actually helps remove the curse by removing a curse stack, 1 curse stack for every time you use the quick card. And as you could see, Van Gogh is a 3 quick card servant, despite having an arch NP, but she has 3 quick cards, which is why it's a good idea to team her up with Skadi. And this effect synergizes really well with the preceding effect, where if the curse removal succeeds, increase own attack by 10% for 3 turns. So again, it's both built in together, so it works really well. But the last part is where everything becomes very interesting for the previous 2 skills, because she absorbs all curse status effects from all the enemies and allies except for own. So in addition to her 3 that she inflicts on her own, she's gonna take all the curses that you've inflicted on your allies and the other 2 servants that you brought with her onto herself. And this is why it's a good idea to team up Van Gogh with another Van Gogh, because the other Van Gogh will most likely apply her own curses via her first skill as well. So all those curses from all the other allies, and assuming if you do it to the enemies, it's also gonna all go to this singular Van Gogh, to this singular servant. Don't worry, she's not gonna die from it because she has a passive where the curse cannot cause her to essentially die. As you can see, curse cannot cause your HP to fall below 1. So she can't die from her own curses. It is going to decrease her HP ever so slightly every turn, but really it's not that much to worry about, because if you're going to be using her, you're most likely going to be ending the battle pretty quickly. Now, why is this important? Why do you want all the curse status effects to go to Van Gogh? Well, if you remember from her first skill, the last bit of her first skill increases her own NP gauge for every curse stack. So that's 3 from her first skill already. That's another 3 thanks to the second skill, where it applies curse to all allies, including herself. So that's 3 extra. So that's 6 overall curses, not even counting the other possible curses that you might have inflicted with another Van Gogh, or let's say you team her up with Waver, who has curse via his NP. Essentially, it helps with her battery is what I'm trying to say. Her battery could go to up to 100%. It could go higher, it could go a little bit lower, but Essentially what I'm trying to say is that it really helps with her battery and really helps with NP looping and buff stacking. Essentially NP loop so you can buff stack and essentially one-shot the enemy, one-shot the boss, because if you look at her NP, it's just purely buffs and debuffs. So it inflicts the debuff of terror, similar to Abigail's second skill, where it's a 60% chance to stun for 1 turn every turn. But more importantly, with her kit, with Van Gogh's kit, is it increases critical strength for all allies for 3 turns, including herself, of course, and then further increases critical strength for all allies if they're entity of the outer realm. So this is why I said earlier that she's sort of a semi-support for foreigners, because pretty much all foreigners are entities of the outer realm, so they're gonna get that further increase in critical strength if you decide to use Van Gogh as a support rather than a offensive servant. Although I would recommend mainly focusing on using her as an offensive servant in a Skadi and other Van Gogh team comps. And then of course she will provide a gain 10 critical stars per turn for self, so 10 crit stars per turn, and then further increases attack of all allies for 3 turns. So as you can see, she's kind of a weird servant. She's very weird, very different. She's like a semi-support Super Ryan, I guess, because unlike Super Ryan, her buffs apply to everybody, but she's weird in the sense that she has this weird obsession, I guess you could say, with curses. It has something to do with her lore, but I'm not going to spoil it for those of you guys who don't know Van Gogh's lore and why, you know, she's a she instead of a he, etc., etc. But as you can see, a lot going on with this servant. Has 3 quick cards, so that goes really well with her second skill. Has very good support capabilities by applying evade to all allies and attack up and critical up with her NP and all that stuff. Very niche when it comes to supporting other foreigners, but still team her up with another Van Gogh, it's gonna be crazy buff stacking. So if I go to the tier list, honestly, this might sound weird because if you look again, if we just look at her skills and whatnot, she seems like she's all over the place, but from my experience and from what I've seen, she could be extremely good in boss fights and you know, crit teams, and again team her up with another Van Gogh, you're gonna go insane. And if you just do double Skadi Van Gogh, that works as well. So I would actually put her at the second tier just because she offers something very different, and she plays her role as a crit servant as well as a semi-support servant really well. It's weird. She's very versatile, but she is able to juggle it very well. And unlike, say, Shonagon, who is arguably also very versatile, as I said earlier, just the sheer fact Van Gogh offers something that other servants can't do, with the exception of, I guess, Super Orion and in a way Himiko. Van Gogh is just very unique in that sense. Honestly, one could make the argument that she should be down here, maybe even as far as down here, but in the right circumstances, particularly of course in boss fights and challenges, she could be a very great servant. And that pretty much wraps up November. Moving on to December, and we are introduced to one of the sexiest male servants in the entire game in the form of 5-star alter ego Ashiya Domon. Not only is he one of the sexiest, he's also one of the most evil servants, story-wise from what we know of, but he's also one of the more big fan favorite servants from what I've seen. If you look at the statistics and the amount of people that like him, based on polls and whatnot, he actually ranks pretty high up there. And I think a lot of it has to do with his design, just the fact that he's, you know, pure evil. We don't really have too many characters that look as good as him, that we could say are pure, unadulterated, unfiltered, just evil. But what about gameplay wise? Let's go look at his skills. I do have him in my other account, so I do have my own personal biases and experience using him. But looking at his first skill, so he relies a lot on debuffs, as you could see. So he decreases the attack of all enemies by 3 turns, defense as well for 3 turns, and applies a terror status. So this is like the 3rd servant of this year that has the terror status. And then confusion, which confusion is unique, where it's a 30% chance to inflict skill seal each turn for 3 turns, and applies curse to all enemies. So I remember when he first came out, people were wondering if he works well with Van Gogh. I would say they work okay with each other, just having that extra bit of curse, but I would say keep Van Gogh with double Skadi or another Van Gogh, but that's besides the point. As far as Ashiya Domon is concerned, I think Ashiya Domon and double Skadi is the way to go, but that's just my opinion. As far as the second skill goes, he does have guts, so he has a bit of survivability. This is 2-time guts, so Unless the enemy has some kind of buff removal, he's going to come back twice, which is very ironic with his character. Increased critical strength for all evil allies. So a little bit of a niche support as well. He does support evil and chaotic allies. Further increases critical strength for all chaotic allies. So I could see him teaming up with, let's say, another Ashiadomon from your support if you already have him. And they could both put each other's critical strength up by a lot because he is a chaotic evil servant. So he synergizes well with himself. And then he actually has a really good battery. So at level 1, it's a 50% NP battery, but at level 10, it goes up to 80 with his 3rd skill. So insane. And then again, he increases attack for evil and chaotic allies for 3 turns and inflicts further curse on enemies. So again, you can team him up with Van Gogh, but I wouldn't do it personally. Real quick, looking at his passive skills, you will see that he has an increased instant death success rate by 20%, which of course works really well with his NP, which has a 120% chance to apply instant death. And the reason why I point this out right away is because with his NP battery with his 3rd skill and the fact that he's a quick AoE servant, most people will look at this on paper and be like, wow, he must be a really good quick looper, personally speaking. He also has apply curse damage up. So again, if you want to do a weird team with him and Van Gogh, it could work out. But otherwise, as far as the tier list is concerned, obviously he is a fan favorite. He is. Most people will go in for his design, for his character, and the whole shebang. But from a gameplay perspective, he's probably somewhere between here and here. I'm not even gonna lie. I know how popular he is, so the fact that I even put him here for a split second might have angered some people. Some people are sweating, their palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy, mom's spaghetti. I understand, but I will put him here just because, again, he has a very, very high NP battery, so his looping isn't that bad. He does have a little bit of nicheness and gimmick, but I would put Ashiadomon there just because his battery is very good. Just because of that. If he didn't have that battery, he would definitely be back down here. But otherwise, yeah, he's good. But as far as looping goes, there are other alternatives and essentially better alternatives. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's bad. Again, he's in that tier for a reason. He's good. And like I said earlier, none of these servants are particularly bad. It just depends on what you have and who you want to prioritize. Now, just like most chapters, this chapter will have a part 2 banner. This one will feature Ibuki Doji. I said earlier that Van Gogh is probably the most complex and unique servant with a lot going on in terms of her skills and NP. On the other side of the spectrum, as far as servants that are very simple, very straightforward, I would say Ibuki Doji, as far as every other servant of this year, is probably the most simplistic to understand when you look at her skills and NP. As you look at her first skill, it's an increased own attack 3 times for 3 turns by 40%. So that's a lot. But again, it's only for 3 times. So you got to choose your attacks wisely and your NP wisely, because this could run out within a turn, really. But it also has a built-in NP battery as well, 50%, which is the highest out of any SSR Saber, I believe, at the moment of recording this. So right away, she has a distinct advantage over a lot of other Sabers, just the fact that she could essentially get to 100% NP if you just slap her with any kind of 50% starting NP craft essence. Second skill, 3-turn buster effectiveness up by 30%, which is pretty decent. Increases defense, which honestly this doesn't come into play that much, but it doesn't really hurt, I guess, for 3 turns for 30%, and drops 20 crit stars, which is, you know, all in one skill, pretty good. Again, very simple skill set. And then the last skill has a bit of utility where she essentially NP seals a single enemy for 1 turn, increases own critical strength by 3 turns for 50%. 50%! That's a lot for 3 turns. So as you could probably tell, she's a very straightforward servant to use, and also has a special attack against undead to self for 3 turns. So a very, I guess you could say, selfish servant. Only buffs herself. The only, I guess, semi-support thing she does is the NP seal and the gain crit stars, because the crit stars could go to other servants as well. But a very selfish servant, only buffs herself. But when you look at her NP, again, very simple servant and straightforward to understand. Apply ignore invincibility to self, which activates first. So her NP is pretty much guaranteed to hit no matter what. and also deals defense ignoring damage to all enemies, which again, couple that with the fact that she has ignore invincibility, which means she's most likely going to do maximum damage 9 times out of 10 unless the enemy has some kind of special damage resistance buff. And as far as the overcharge effect goes, it does decrease bust resist for all enemies for 3 turns. So a very simplistic servant, very easy to understand, easy to use. Obviously you're going to be teaming her up with Merlin, maybe Himiko, depending on what you have. And of course, a year from then, you're going to be teaming her up with Koyanskaya once she comes out. But don't get it twisted. Just because she's a very simple servant with very simplistic skills, doesn't have a lot of utility aside from the NP seal and the invincibility ignore. She's a very, very powerful servant. Very powerful in terms of crit damage, in terms of being a buster servant. Has 3 buster cards. Very powerful servant. Her simplicity is actually her biggest strength. And obviously, I'm very biased with her, as you guys might know if you've been a subscriber for a while. I really, really like her. I would say she's probably the strongest buster AoE saber out there as far as SSRs go. But another integral reason why I also put her a bit lower is because not too long after she comes out for New Year's, Muramasa does come out, who is an art servant, AoE art servant, who has ignore invincibility as well with one of his skills. But the fact that he's an art servant means he's able to NP loop right away. You don't have to wait for Koyanskaya to come out for him to NP loop. Whereas for Ibuki Doji, you do have to wait for Koyanskaya to come out, which if you're impatient and you already have Caster Arturia from the FGO anniversary, then definitely save for Muramasa instead. From a gameplay perspective, it just makes more sense to go for him over Ibuki. But if you're patient and you like Ibuki's design and you like Buster Servants more, and you plan on going for Koyanskaya and you don't really have a good dedicated Buster AoE saber, then definitely go for Ibuki, in which case I would put her higher. Assuming you want to go for Muramasa, I would prioritize Muramasa over Ibuki. To wrap up 2022 and to wrap up December is of course going to be our Christmas servant, 5-star Lancer, Vitra. So right off the bat, I just gotta let you guys know, she's a non-limited servant, so you probably already know which tier I'm going to put her in, to be honest. So just like Ibuki Doji that came before her skills are very easy to understand, very simple. She increases her own arts effectiveness for 3 turns and arts gather rates as well for crit stars. Her second skill does have apply special attack against divine enemies to all allies, so it's kind of a semi-support, sort of a niche sort of buff, but there are a lot of divine enemies and divine servants in general, so it's actually not that bad. And of course, she has a 30% NP battery, which again, any servant with an NP battery automatically goes from to pretty decent, pretty good. Not only applying guts to herself 1 time, 5 turns, she increases her own NP gauge each turn for 5 turns, could go up to 10%, and then increases NP strength for all allies 1 time, 5 turns. So I wish this was 3 times or at least just 5 turns in general. That would make her a lot better, but still, she has no problem getting her NP back, especially with an AoE arts NP. So her NP applies skill seal to all enemies for 1 turn and also decreases critical rate for all enemies by 20% for 3 turns. So not bad, and it also decreases arts resist to all enemies, and that's after damage, I'm pretty sure, for 3 turns. So if you loop her NP, which you're most likely going to be able to do, she's actually a pretty decent looper. She's sort of like a more expensive female version of Fion in some ways. I think Fion might be a little bit more efficient as far as NP gain, but as you can see, she's no slouch when it comes to increasing her NP gauge via her second and third skill. And if you're fighting a boss with breaks or a couple of bosses with breaks, then that decreased arts resist for all enemies might come in handy, because it's gonna basically snowball her NP to do more and more damage each consecutive turn. But as you might have guessed, as good as she is non-limited, and like I said with when I mentioned Fion, there are technically other cheaper alternatives. So she's good, there's other alternatives. So I kind of feel bad for keeping Nemo down here, but I feel like since I made this tier, somebody had to be there. I'm sorry, Nemo. It's just comparatively speaking to the other non-limited servants, you're a bit more niche than the other guys and other girls. So sorry Nemo. I'm sorry. I feel like a lot of people like him, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible. As a quick recap, get Caster Arturia, gonna elevate your account to the next level, regardless if you're new or old or you're a veteran, whatever. I don't care what your reasoning might be. To skip out on Caster Arturia would be an absolute travesty for an account for an entire year, because she does get another rate up the following year. But the thing is about 2023 is that year is going to have a lot of great servants as well. So I wouldn't wait for her next rate up, honestly, just because the next year arguably has just as many crazy servants, if not crazier servants than 2022. So go get her right when she comes out. Use the anniversary quartz, use the anniversary tickets, do what you need to do to get at least one copy. In my recommendation, 2 is actually not that bad of a place to get her as well. As far as highly recommended goes, Yang plus burn damage plus the Honey Lake CE that you get from the summer event, really good. Works really well with command codes. Her applying burn is not that hard at all with her skills and command codes. Summary Kiara, because she is a good art slooping servant, synergizes really well with Caster Arturia, a good alternative if you do not have Spaces Ssr. She also has some support by applying evade to all allies, and some utility because she also heals herself while also removing her own debuffs, so that could come in handy when it comes to getting NP sealed or some kind of debuff to herself. Himiko's in this tier because she synergizes well with Caster Arturia, funny enough, despite not being an art slooper. Team her up with Merlin as well, and you're gonna have a really crazy, reliable, viable team when it comes to stalling, when it comes to boss fights. Similar thing with Van Gogh in that sense. You team Van Gogh up with another Van Gogh or double Skadi. You're gonna have an insane boss killer, essentially a quick Super Ryan if you want to put it in simple terms. As far as the good servants go, these are all servants that if you have other alternatives, other servants in your arsenal that sort of fill that same niche that they do. For example, say Shonagon has the potential of doing a lot of damage, but if you want consistent damage, and you have Gilgamesh already or Ishtar or Nikola Tesla, you don't necessarily need to go for her. And as far as looping goes, there are other alternatives as well, like Atalanta, Lancelot Berserker, Edmund Dantes, etc. And the same principle pretty much works with Odysseus, Dioscuri. Romulus is good. He is a bit gimmicky. And if you have Rishgal or Karna, then I really don't see any practical reason to go for Romulus. I would use the same argument for Voyager as I did with Say. Same thing with Abigail. Essentially same thing with Ashia Domon. I would put Ibuki higher, but objectively speaking, it doesn't take until Coin Sky comes out for her to be where these other servants are at. Otherwise, she doesn't really do anything that unique besides like super high damage. One of the more simple servants to come out of this year. Same thing with Vitra. Very good looper, but doesn't offer any of the utility that, let's say, Summer Kiara does. And if you already have Fion Cumhill and you don't really mind using him, then he could pretty much fill up her slot without taking up that much cost. And then there's, of course, Nemo, who I kind of feel bad for him being the only one there. You know what? I'm going to give him a partner just for the sake of it. I'm going to put Voyager there. Let's just have them both down there, I guess, just for the sake of quelling thy anger, because I'm sure some of you guys might feel a certain way about Voyager being higher than Nemo. So I'll put them both there. I think this tier list is pretty, spot on for at least what I would go for. For what you guys will go for, I have no idea. This whole tier list might be flipped upside down on its head. Although I will be very surprised if none of you guys have Caster Arturia on the top of your tier list, on the top of your goals for next year as far as FGO NA is concerned. And that's pretty much it for 2022. This is what I would roll for. This is who I would prioritize. Of course, comment down below. Let me know what you think about my tier list. Let me know who's in the top of your list. If you want to make your own tier list, I'll put a link in the description below. And you can send that to me via Twitter or Discord. Just make sure to tag me. And of course, like the video if you like it. Dislike it if you disliked it. I don't know if I offended anybody or anything with these rankings. I don't mean this personally. Again, none of these servants are bad necessarily. I think all the 5-star servants that are coming out of 2022 are pretty good and viable. It's just I wanted to see where I would rank them in a tier list as far as must-have to like least should go for, I guess. And it goes without saying, good luck to all you guys. Hopefully we all have a smooth year next year. We all get who we want without breaking bank, without going too crazy with our money. And of course, subscribe to become a supporting character to me, the main character, because without you guys, I'd be the only character and that would honestly suck. So yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one, whenever that will be. Bye-bye.